independent candidate, LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Congress, Joel DeJean, and we have named this forum, which may be the first of many, but this is called Bury the Global Green Deal. Let's light up the world. So there's a task, there's a mission, and there's a positive future if we accomplish the mission we've set out for ourselves. Just a little bit about Joel and his campaign. I am speaking to you from Houston. I understand that there are some people on here tonight that are from outside of the district and outside of the city. So I'm very proud to live in Houston, even though I'm not a native of Texas. Those of us that remember, and we did actually commemorate this 8 days ago, Moon Day, was that breathtaking day in July of 1969, July 20th, when the whole world watched, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin brought that tiny little capsule down from the orbiter, and Neil Armstrong piloted that craft down to the surface of the moon. It was nothing automatic about it. But at the point of that triumphant accomplishment, Neil Armstrong said to the world, "Houston, the Eagle has landed." And so that is one of the attributes of Houston. We are known as Space City. We're also the energy city, and the use of hydrocarbon energy has been, of course, part of mankind's existence since the discovery of fire in the primordial days up to the present. And that is particularly germane to the district that Joel DeJean is running in. But we're also a city with a fabulous medical center and a port, which is the biggest in the United States in terms of the tonnage. So it could be the gateway to the world. And of course, people are moving to Texas. While other states are diminishing their population, in the last census, Texas picked up 2 congressional districts, one by the state capitol in Austin and one here in Harris County and Houston, the 38th district for which Joel is contending. And I will tell you, Joel is on the ballot. I personally and my friends sweated it out during the month of June to get the signatures required, and we got well over the 500 that the state requires to place Joel on the ballot as an independent candidate. And so we have a district which includes the entirety of what we call the energy corridor here in Houston, which includes corporate headquarters for BP, ConocoPhillips. There's installations for National Oil Well, Varco, and other petroleum and gas-related industries, as well as the machine tools and other components. Siemens has an office in the district, and it stretches north through Jersey Village, suburbs of Cypress, Klein, and Champion Forest up to Tomball. But it's a brand new district with no incumbent. And so you would think with all of that, that the future would be bright, but there's an uncertainty here. In fact, when you look around Houston, it's normal to see homeless people at the stoplights, tents here and there, not as bad as other cities. But there is another famous phrase from another Apollo mission: Houston, we have a problem. And I will conclude this little introduction by pointing to a headline that appeared in the Chronicle last week on Friday, that Houston, the Gulf, may get a massive wind farm. So we're going to talk about that tonight. But let me just state at the start, Joel DeJean is going to speak and with an opening statement, followed by our very special guest, Dr. Neil Frank, whom I will introduce, and then come back to Joel, and we welcome your questions. If you have questions on the Facebook stream, you can type them into the chat. If you're accessing otherwise, send them to the email, and we'll consider them one at a time. The email is Joel DeJean, DEJEAN, for Congress @gmail.com. Okay. So with that, let's let's get started. Welcome, Joel. Welcome, Dr. Frank. Joel, why don't you situate, why did you run for Congress as an independent? What do you expect to accomplish in this campaign? And particularly the topic of this, bury the Green New Deal and let's light up the world. Take it away, Joel. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Dr. Frank, for joining us. Now, on February 9th of 2021, Joe Jennings and I testified to the Houston City Council and the mayor of Houston, Sylvester Turner, on their climate action plan and their adoption and promotion of the Green New Deal and renewable energy and the Great Reset. We even provided them copies of a special report from the LaRouche organization titled "Crush the Green New Deal." This Green New Deal and the Great Reset is a great leap backwards. Now, less than 1 week after our testimony, and by the way, our testimony generated no questions. So 1 week later, on February 15th, Houston and the whole state of Texas entered into a deep freeze. It was 16 degrees Fahrenheit in Houston, 9 degrees Fahrenheit in Dallas, colder in the northern panhandle area, including Lubbock. So what happened is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas warned us that we may have rolling blackouts because they had previewed at the 30 gigawatts of wind power that we have installed in mostly West Texas over the last 20 years would only put out 10% of that, or less than 3 gigawatts. And they had factored that in, and not to worry because we had backup natural gas generators. Everything is under control. We may just have a few rolling blackouts lasting 40 minutes. Well, we did not have rolling blackouts. We had a shutdown of the entire grid. 90% of the 30 million residents in Texas depend on the grid controlled by ERCOT. And we came within minutes of a total collapse, which would have taken weeks, if not months, to restart. So they assured us, well, we had to shut down the system, otherwise it would have totally collapsed. Now, we were in the dark, freezing for 48 to 72 hours. And I've seen different estimates, but up to 1,000 Texans lost their lives, either from freezing, carbon monoxide poisoning, because people bring their generators and their cookers close to their living quarters. We had veterans who ran out of oxygen. One in particular went to his pickup truck to get a spare oxygen tank and never made it back into his house. So this was a total disaster. So you would assume that Joe and I would have received calls from the city council and the mayor saying, you were right, LaRouche was right. Come down and talk to us for a half hour, an hour, what should we do? Well, we didn't get any calls. And Mayor Sylvester Turner went on national television the following Sunday. He was on Face the Nation, and he defaced the nation by saying, see, the Texas freeze proves that global climate change is real. Now, I don't know why he keeps attacking Israel, but he keeps saying global climate change is real. Now, not only that, but a couple months later, in April and then in May, the Houston LaRouche movement went up to the state capitol, went to Austin to organize the state legislature, which meets every other year. We went there to organize them to re-regulate the electric power grid, get rid of these windmills, stick with fossil fuels, transition to small modular nuclear reactors, fund things like fusion research. And they were too busy discussing how to prevent transgenders from playing in girls' sports. So they did very little change in the electric grid. And this summer, we received urgent emails again from ERCOT saying, because of the lack of production, again from the windmills, again, 30 gigawatts was putting out less than 3 gigawatts. So they told us, put your air conditioning above 78 degrees Fahrenheit, do not run any major appliances, and hunker down. So this was for the last 2 weeks. Now, in that time, I decided to run for this new seat in the 38th district. And last April, my campaign went to the Baker Institute at Rice University. And it's the James Baker III Institute, named after former Secretary of State James Baker, who is the leading endorser of my Republican opponent in the 38th district, my Republican opponent, Wesley Hunt. And James Baker, along with George Shultz, when he was alive, were big pushers of carbon tax and decarbonizing the economy. They just want to do it a little slower than the Democrats. So at that meeting, a climate professor, Professor Daniel Cohen, was introducing his new book on climate gridlock. And he was getting questions of the lead business writer for the Houston Chronicle, Chris Tomlinson, total softball questions. And I got a couple of questions in at the end to Professor Cohen. I told him I was running as an independent in the new district, the Energy Corridor District, the 38th district. And I also told him that I was born in the country which has the lowest carbon footprint in the entire Western Hemisphere, namely Haiti. And 75% of the power in Haiti is generated by charcoal. And half the population has no access to electricity. I asked the professor, what would happen to non-developed countries like Haiti if we decarbonize and if we jack up the price of fossil fuels? And he was sympathetic. He said, oh, we wouldn't force Haiti to decarbonize. We would just urge Haiti to leapfrog into renewables. And he used the example of Africa leapfrogging over landlines, skipping the landline phone system and going straight to cell phones. Well, it just so happens that the other country in the world that has an even greater percentage of charcoal power than Haiti is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has 90% of its power comes from charcoal. So where are all the tree lovers? Now the Congo happens to be situated near the Congo River, which there are plans over the last decades to build a 40 gigawatt hydroelectric power production on the Congo River. So the Congo could be electrified literally in the coming years. Now, we went after this professor and he kept pushing the line that we have to decarbonize. So as part of my campaign, going after this ridiculous push for renewable energy. And as Joe mentioned at the beginning, now that the land-based windmills have totally failed, and they repeatedly fail every time you need power during peak power, they put out less than 10% of their rated capacity. So they are total failures. We spent billions of dollars. These windmills cost $3 million a piece. We built, like I said, 11,000 of them in West Texas. Well, now the Biden administration has this great idea. Well, we'll just build them offshore. And they have a plan to have an almost 1,000 square mile grid of offshore windmills, and these windmills are even bigger than the land-based ones. Some of them are 12 megawatts rated, but they admit that if they have an approaching hurricane, these windmills would have to be feathered. In other words, zero power during a storm. So I have to ask myself, why has this been pushed? And it's been pushed by Republicans in the state of Texas, from George W. Bush, Enron, Rick Perry, Greg Abbott. He had the bright idea to say, well, since these windmills spin mostly at night, we'll just invite Bitcoin miners to run their computers in West Texas. So I have to ask myself repeatedly, this is such a failure. Why has it been promoted and pushed? And I got a bit of an answer on that a couple of weeks ago. I was listening to a radio interview with a University of Texas at Austin journalism professor who is now retired. He's a professor emeritus, Robert Jensen. I've heard him before. He's one of these deep ecology crazies. And he said flat out to his interviewer, well, we have to be honest with people that, first of all, he accepts all the nonsense about CO2 and we have to cut use completely of fossil fuels. He said to the interviewer, well, we have to tell people, look, we cannot sustain 8 billion people on this planet with renewable energy. Wind, solar, energy storage will not cut. We can only sustain 4 to 6 billion people with renewable energy. We're going to have to give up flying jets. We're going to have to give up jet travel. We're going to have to give up intercity travel. We're going to have to live in self-contained villages, and you're going to have to wallow in your circumstance. Now, he did not give a list of who the 2 billion plus that he's going to get rid of. So this is what's behind the push for Green New Deal, renewable energy. This is coming from Prince Charles down, and it's promoted by lawyers, journalism professors, and political science majors who wouldn't know the difference between a kilowatt, a kilojoule, or a kilowhale. These guys are completely ignorant. A freshman electrical engineering student would be able to explain to them the necessity to balance supply and demand in the electric grid. So this is not a mistake. This is a deliberate policy. Now, all we have to do is go back to the ideas that actually built this country. Besides the Apollo program, if you look at the reaction to the spectacular images coming from the James Webb Telescope, which took 25 years to put up into space, involved 20,000 scientists and engineers from 14 countries, a real collaborative effort. And it's a spectacular success. And if you look at the images of these galaxies, we have literally trillions of galaxies, each one with over 100 billion stars. Each one of these stars is a fusion reactor. So who could say, unless they have their heads up their ass so far they can't see light, that there is a limit to growth, that we have to live on this small planet and just deal with the resources we have here. We have infinite resources. The biggest resource we have is our creative intelligence. So if you look at the potential, we have to, one, scrap this whole idea of renewable energy. It's not net zero, it's net negative. We have to go and continue to use fossil fuels, gas turbines, bring back the coal plants, oil, and we have, any transition has to go towards a higher energy flux density, like small modular nuclear reactors, and eventually fusion. And I made a proposal about a year and a half ago that one of the best things the US could do to poor countries like Haiti is to help them transition from charcoal power to fusion power. That would be the type of foreign policy that would win friends all over the world. If we collaborate with China, with Russia, with India, with all the nations in the world, because with 2 trillion galaxies, there's no reason to fight over pieces of dirt here on Earth. So I'll stop there and look forward to Dr. Frank's comments.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Joel. And you provoked a lot of questions, which we're going to try to answer. And I want to remind everyone that if you are just joining us, this is a special webcast sponsored by the Joel DeJean Independent Campaign for U.S. Congress here in the 38th District of Texas. I just happen to have a copy of the pamphlet here that Joel was talking about, which made history because this went out at the United Nations in New York. We took it to Austin, Texas with us. And I will say that we moved whole nations to challenge this image that Joel laid out about living in the little village, within your limited means. That's called colonialism. That's what we fought the American Revolution against, and we certainly shouldn't be enforcing it on anybody else. So under a green umbrella or whatever. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome our next guest. Dr. Neil Frank is a very esteemed meteorologist with a long history. There was 2 decades in the mid 80s to the early throughout the 90s and beyond. You would turn on the evening news and you'd see Dr. Frank's smiling face. He was the weatherman on KHOU News here. He also, prior to that, was headed the National Hurricane Center down in Florida, which is very important, certainly to us here in Houston, where we're always looking over our shoulder for the next hurricane, particularly in hot summers like what we're enjoying just now. But for all those credentials, Dr. Frank tells me he cannot get published in the Houston Chronicle. So I wonder why that is, but we certainly welcome him to our platform tonight. So given what Joel had to say, what are your thoughts on the situation, Dr. Frank?
Yeah, I'm going to pick it. Joel, I really appreciate the comments that you made. Let me pick up a little bit. You indicated that in that February freeze a year ago, that the wind power was not blowing, it was diminished, okay? The reason for that is there is no wind. When you have the coldest temperature settled over you, a cold front moves through, here comes this big dome of cold air, sits right over you, there's no wind. The same thing happens in the summertime when you have this big ball of hot air sit right over you, and now we need air conditioning, there is no wind. So the instability of wind is amazing. And I'm of the opinion that we shouldn't even be talking about a $1 trillion Green New Deal. What a tragedy, because carbon dioxide, the data shows that carbon dioxide is not a major factor in the Earth's temperature. Now, I'll come back to that, but I want to start with a statement here that even skeptics believe that the Earth has warmed over the last 175 years. That's true. There's no question that it's warmed. The question that can be debated is what is causing that warming. The alarmists would have us believe that it's carbon dioxide generated by burning fossil fuels, driving your SUV, for example. And this carbon dioxide is what is causing the Earth to warm. Now, the skeptics say, no. The data shows that carbon dioxide is not a major factor in the Earth's temperature, that the Earth temperature changes because of natural cycles. So I'd like to spend just a minute talking about natural cycles. You know, the Earth's temperature follows cycles. The longest cycle we're aware of is the Ice Age. Ice Age lasts 100,000 years, separated by a 10,000 year warm period. And that's where we are now. We're right in the middle of this 10,000, well, we're not in the middle, we're at the end of the 10,000 year warm period from the last Ice Age, and we're headed towards another Ice Age that could be decades, centuries away, but I'm telling you, it is going to occur. So there is a cycle, 1,000-year cycle, long term. Now, if you look at the 10,000 years, there is another cycle. This cycle is 1,000 years. Every 1,000 years, the temperature peaks. And that's where we are right now. We're in the peak of this 1,000-year cycle. 1,000 years ago, the earth was warmer than today, and they farmed into Greenland for 400 years. 2,000 years ago, the Roman period, was warmer than today. 3,000 years ago, warmer than today. 7,000, 8,000, the temperature was 2, maybe 3 degrees centigrade warmer than today. The point I'm trying to make is there are cycles. Then if you go back the last couple of 100 years, there's a shorter cycle. That would be a 60-year cycle. In other words, the earth warms for 30 years and then it cools for 30 years. So let's go back to the last 10,000 years. Every one of those peaks involved a warming like we are experiencing right now. We have a warming to that peak. So we've had 10 warming periods over the last 10,000 years. That's what I mean by a natural cycle. Now, the alarmists would like us to believe that man is causing all this problem. And it's interesting that Mark Levin wrote an interesting book on the media. And he has one chapter there on forming public opinion. And he said, particularly when the event you're trying to sell isn't true, he said you can do 3 things. You can lie about it, you can omit certain critical information, or you can use propaganda. And it's interesting that he uses climate change as an example of propaganda. Now, I want to go back to the omission and get back to this carbon dioxide thing. When was the last time anyone emphasized to you that carbon dioxide was a minor gas? It's not 10% of the atmosphere. It's not 5% of the atmosphere. It's not 4% of the atmosphere. It's not 0.4% of the atmosphere. It's 0.04 of the atmosphere, 400 parts per million. Let's put that in perspective. The football stadium at Dallas holds 100,000 people. If we assign a molecule of air to every one of those seats, there would be over 70,000 nitrogen seats. There'd be over 20,000 oxygen seats. Do you know how many seats there'd be for carbon dioxide? 40. And I don't think 40 is going to control the atmosphere in a football game in Dallas, nor do I believe that 0.04% of the atmosphere, 400 parts per million, is going to control the temperature of the globe. And yet that's what we're being told. And furthermore, there's a very poor correlation between carbon dioxide and the Earth's temperature. Let's go back 10,000 years. Remember, I told you every 1,000 years there's a peak in the temperature. If carbon dioxide was responsible for that, then we should see peaks in the carbon dioxide levels. They're not there. There's no peaks. So we went through natural cycles. And as a matter of fact, if you take a look at the last 10,000 years, what the alarmists are telling us, when the carbon dioxide increased, the temperature increased, the opposite occurs. At the beginning of this 10,000 year period, the Earth was warm and the carbon dioxide levels were down around 240 or 250 parts per million. Then gradually the carbon dioxide levels increased to the end of that 10,000 year period to 280 or 290. At the same time, the temperature decreased, the opposite of what you're being told. Now let's go on a shorter time scale. Let's go back to, and carbon dioxide started increasing right after World War II. And right at that time, the Earth was in a cold cycle. Remember, I told you the Earth had a 60-year cycle, warm versus cold. So from 1940 to 1975, the Earth was in a cold cycle while carbon dioxide was increasing. The opposite of what you're being told. As a matter of fact, there was great concern among all the experts that we were headed towards an ice age. As a matter of fact, they had an international meeting of all the experts in the world, and they became so concerned that they sent Nixon a letter and said, start saving food because this cold is going to destroy the agriculture. And then the Earth went into its warm cycle at the same time that carbon dioxide was increasing. So in the 80s and 90s, there is one 30-year period where there's excellent correlation between the two. And then in 1998, the Earth went into its cold cycle and the temperature just plateaued off while the carbon dioxide continues to increase. Now, the point I'm trying to make you is over the last 10,000 years, there's only been one 30-year period in the 80s and the 90s when there was excellent coordination between carbon dioxide and the Earth's temperature. And all the alarmist statements were generated during this period of time, and those alarmist statements still carry on today. It's amazing. In the last time, let me make one more point about carbon dioxide. When was the last time you heard anything positive about carbon dioxide? Plants love carbon dioxide. As a matter of fact, if plants don't get carbon dioxide, they all die. If the carbon dioxide levels drop below 180, that would be 18 seats in our stadium. All plants die and all human beings are going to die. In the last 10,000 years, the carbon dioxide levels have been barely above that level in the 200 range. That's kind of scary. At times, the carbon dioxide level would drop down to that point. So this is pretty scary. So what is the optimum levels of carbon dioxide as far as plants and as far as human life is concerned? Nobody can give me an answer to that. But I'll tell you what, the people that run nurseries have an answer. For the last several decades, in nurseries that could control their environment, they pump the carbon dioxide levels up to 1,200. That would be 120 seats in our stadium. Now, you don't ever hear anything about that. Satellite pictures would show that in the last 30 years, there's been a greening of the planet, some 20 to 30%. We need to get this information out to people. One final point that I'd like to make, alarmists would like for us to believe that we are the one responsible for all of the problems. They've zeroed in on 5 meteorological parameters, and they said all these parameters are increasing in frequency and increasing in intensity. Let's go down through the list. We're seeing increasing droughts. No, we're not. The government has been keeping track of droughts since 1919, and there's been a gradual decrease in the number of droughts. Nothing today compares to what happened in the Dust Bowls of the 30s. How about wildfires? Oh, we're seeing an increase in wildfires. No, if you take a look at the data from 1926, the government has published the data showing the acreage that is burned by wildfire. And I'm telling you, before the World War II, I mean, it was bad, even bad in World War II. Then in the late 50s and the 60s, there was an immediate downturn. And I asked some foresters, I said, what happened? I said, well, we introduced some very effective programs that saved the forest. But in the 90s, the environmentalists got involved and they made us stop using some of those programs. And there has been an increase of the damage from wildfires. Or how about sea level? By the year 2100, New York City, Miami Beach, Galveston will all be underwater. Well, we've been tracking the sea level rise since 1855. The sea level is rising at the rate of 8 inches per century. Let me emphasize that, 8 inches per century. And 8 inches is not going to flood New York City. Or how about the Earth is the warmest it's ever been? I saw an article a year ago that said this decade was the warmest temperature that has ever been measured on the Earth. And furthermore, this is the second warmest decade in record. Now, what they don't emphasize to you is the records only go back to 1880. And measured means it was measured by a thermometer. And they started the records in 1880. I have no reason why they did that. If you take a look at the distribution of weather stations in 1880, it is frightening. So what was the temperature? Well, we really don't know. And so the temperature record as determined by thermometers is pretty shaky in terms of the first part. But now I've already told you, let's go back 10,000 years. Every 1,000 years, the temperature has been warmer than today. They've lied to you. Well, how about storm? Do you know if you define a tornado as a violent one with 160-mile-an-hour winds, and they've been tracking these since 1950. There is a substantial decrease in the number of storms, and in 2018, there was 0. Oh, how about hurricanes? Worldwide, we have hurricane-type storms. In the Pacific, they call them typhoons, and in Australia, they call them cyclones. There's about 47 of these a year. There's been a 5 to 10% decrease since 1980, and we've had good satellite pictures over the last 40 years, so we feel fairly confident about that. There's been a decrease in the number of hurricane-type storms over the last 40 years. They've lied to you. There's no question about it. So what's driving this whole thing? Well, let me read you a statement here by Morris Strong. He is a millionaire out of Canada. And Morris Strong said, isn't the only hope for this planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? And it isn't our responsibility to bring that about. And then one of the senior officials at UN, a German, said, we redistribute wealth by climate policy. We've got to get over the notion that climate policy is an environmental issue. I believe that the real push behind this is a world and international effort to bring about a Marxist one world government. And I appreciate the stand that you're taking.
Thank you, Dr. Frank.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Frank. And once again, if you're just coming on a little late, you've jumped into a very interesting webcast with Dr. Neil Frank, meteorologist, whom you just heard, and our candidate for Congress, Joel DeJean. And I want to encourage everyone, because I'm sure not everyone agrees with everything you heard here. And in fact, simple disclaimer, just because someone says something, it doesn't necessarily mean that represents the campaign, but certainly if it comes from Joel DeJean, he's the candidate, and everything that comes out of his mouth does represent the sentiment of the campaign. That said, I really want people to get your questions out, because this is a very, very controversial and complex topic. So you can, if you're on the Facebook live stream, you can enter something in the chat, and that will be texted to me, or you can email to Joel DeJean for Congress @gmail.com. But we do already have a question before, and I'll submit a couple of these to you right now, Joel, and maybe you can incorporate them into your wrap up, and then we'll open up for general question and answer. There's several questions here about nuclear power. Elizabeth is asking, how many years does it take to build a nuclear power plant in the US, South Africa, Egypt, Russia, China? Well, I guess the question is, why not go nuclear? Is there anything prohibiting the further exploitation of nuclear energy? Diane is asking, why have we not been able to use nuclear energy? Who is stopping that, and why? And more broadly, Mason is asking, if climate change isn't an area of concern for you, then which environmental issues are, and why don't we combine all of our efforts on fixing those instead? And he says, are you willing to be wrong? So there's some contention there. So that's what makes it interesting. So Joel, why don't you think, looking back on what Dr. Frank just told us, and maybe thinking of these questions, kind of make a summation, and where do we go from here? Joel?
First off, I want to thank Dr. Frank, and now I see why the Houston Chronicle refuses to publish any of your opinions, because they don't want the truth getting out.
That's right.
They want a controlled narrative. Now, as far as my environmental concerns, I do have concerns. The worst pollution is poverty. All you have to do is take a trip to a third world nation. And I wouldn't advise traveling to Port-au-Prince, Haiti right now. But when things calm down, the worst pollution is when you have no sanitation, when you have no water treatment plants, when you have total poverty, where people live in their squalor, that is the worst form of environmental degradation. And the same people who are against using fossil fuels are against using nuclear power. Look at what's happened to Germany. Here, the Germans, who were supposedly led by a physicist, Angela Merkel. I don't know what crackerjack's box she got her physics degree from, but she, after the Fukushima accident, which was a 9.0 earthquake that caused a tsunami that killed 20,000 people in Japan, nobody to date has died of nuclear radiation. She used that accident to push for shutting down the nuclear plants in Germany. At the same time, they shut down their coal plants. And now that they can't get the natural gas, they're forced to reopen the coal plants. So it's a total destruction of a German industrial base. And here in this country, we built nuclear plants at the rate of dozens a year in the 70s. Normally, it could take 4 to 5 years to build a 1 to 1.2 gigawatt major pressurized water reactor. And if we go to small modular reactors in the 100 to 300 megawatt range, we could mass produce these in factories and deploy them as needed. We could have a renaissance in nuclear energy in the coming period. And eventually, we need to go to thermonuclear fusion, because that would be the perfect way to travel across the solar system with nuclear fusion rockets. So there's no reason why we slowed down nuclear production in this country. It was the environmentalists. And I remember my last year in Stony Brook University in New York State, we had the China syndrome with Jane Fonda, that great nuclear physicist, and Jack Lemmon, who had this movie about an accident in a nuclear plant. And that movie came out a few weeks before the 3 Mile Island. So the scare stories of the news media and Hollywood is why we stopped building nuclear plants. And if people are educated, then we can turn it back on a dime.
Yeah, and I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Frank in a second here, but Joel, your former career was as an electrical engineer, isn't that true? And you had a certain expertise on this question of atmospheric carbon dioxide versus water vapor and all that?
Yes, first of all, the reason why I am in Texas is because when I graduated in 1980, I came for an interview at the Dallas Defense Electronics plant of Texas Instruments in April of 1980, and it was 92 degrees out, and I loved it. So I engineered my own climate change by moving to Texas. And the first summer I was here, June 1980 to August 1980, we had 60 days of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. So people have very short-term memories.
That's right.
And I want to pose this to Dr. Frank. I don't know if you've noticed the use of this real field temperature. I'm convinced that a lot of these modern day news shows emphasize this real field temperature, because if you say the field temperature is 105 and the air temperature is 95, people will remember, oh, it's over 100 degrees. So it's part of the psychological warfare to get people to think the world is heating up.
That's right.
Do you have anything to say to that, Dr.
Yeah,
Frank?
no, I don't like the field temperature. If it's 95 degrees, I don't have to tell you that when you go outside, it's hot. And people that live in Houston, they don't have to be told, oh, it feels like 105 when it's only 95. No, I don't like that term at all.
And also, I heard a story, Joel, when you went to, and Joel is quite an accomplished scholar up there at Bronx School of Science and then Stony Brook. And didn't they plan a field trip or something to the Shoreham nuclear plant in Long Island? What happened with that, Joel?
Yes, my final semester, I was part of the on-campus IEEE, basically the Union for Electrical Electronic Engineers that sets the standards for the internet and electrical amperages and things like that. We went to the Shoreham plant, which was a few miles from the Stony Brook campus. And this was in April of 1980 again. And the plant was 95% complete. They were about to turn the thing on. They had spent $5 billion. And that year, at the end of that year, Mario Cuomo, the father of Andrew Cuomo, Mario Cuomo put a requirement that the local lighting company, Lilco, had to have an evacuation plan to get 2 million people off of Long Island in a matter of hours if there was an accident, which was impossible. So that plant was never completed. It was destroyed. The reactor vessel was destroyed. So they spent $5 billion, and the state bought that plant from Vilco for a few dollars because they bankrupted the company. So that is why we haven't built more nuclear plants. And Andrew Cuomo and this new governor, Hochul, just shut down Indian Point in New York State, which provided 25% of the electricity in New York City. So that's the type of craziness that has sabotaged our nuclear industry.
Yes, you mentioned the Fukushima incident. This is a huge tsunami, a tidal wave swept over that island of Japan, and 20,000 people were killed. And yet the kind of alarmist coverage in the media would have that this was because of the nuclear plant, which was absolutely not true. But in fact, as a result of the psychological hysteria that was generated out of that incident, I think there were 2 units or maybe even 3 that were scheduled to be brought online at the Bay City nuclear plant here in Texas. I talked to some of the personnel that worked there. The blueprints were there. It was all ready to go. And after Fukushima, the entire thing was scrapped. And so now, having abandoned the nuclear option, you have these geniuses, and I will refer back to this wonderful pamphlet, which we can get to you if you wish, which goes into some of the statistics that is talking about on page 24, how much land area is required to produce 8,000 gigawatts of power, right? And it makes a comparison. You're talking 8,000 gigawatts of power out of a nuclear plant would be the equivalent land area required of Bronx and Queens in New York. Solar panels, you're talking about the entire United States west of the Mississippi. And for an equivalent with windmills, that's assuming that the wind is blowing, I suppose, you're talking about the entirety of North America without Mexico and Alaska. So I guess there'd be no room for the people then. And that is ultimately the consequence of these zero carbon policies. And Mr. LaRouche talked about this decades ago, that if you reduce the energy throughput to below the level for the sustenance of human life, then you will see all sorts of consequences in terms of famine, disease, and depopulation. And I just read yesterday in the case of what had been the second poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, that is Guyana, formerly part of, well, actually maybe even today, part of the British Commonwealth. They have a new prime minister. They've discovered some oil, which they're eager to excavate and market to improve their own existence. And I'll be darned if Secretary of State Blinken, got the prime minister on the phone and wagged his little finger at him that you have to be concerned about your carbon footprint. Guyana, and I think the prime minister may have smiled a little bit, because the world is moving on the nuclear energy question. Egypt just broke ground on a beautiful new nuclear plant. Also, Turkey. Both of these are being done with the assistance of Russia. China is working on the modular reactors. And one of the points that we have made in this other pamphlet we put out is that if the US is going to insist upon green policies applied to the rest of the world that is yearning for and craving its own development, and the US chooses to enforce the zero carbon, the zero growth green agenda, then that is a formula that could actually take the world toward thermonuclear war. And yes, indeed, you would see some very abrupt climate change if it comes to that. So we're not going to let that happen. And Joel's campaign is a very important component in bringing our nation back to sanity. Let's see what other questions we have here. This is from, let's see. This is from Betty. Why are we banning nitrogen-based fertilizer when nitrogen is a major part of our atmosphere? And then another question, who is responsible for all the lying, and why do Americans swallow these lies whole? So I'll leave that for either of you to pick up on. Either Dr. Frank, do you want to start on that one, if you can?
Well, the people that are making the lies are basing their information on numerical models and the prediction of the models. But every test of these numerical models, and I'm talking about global models, have failed. They forecast a condition that'll be 1 to 1 degree to 1.5 too warm for a 50-year forecast. So all of the statements they make are based on the models, not based on the fact.
Joel?
Yeah, I remember my first computer class was Fortran, formula translation, and the sign, a lot of people have heard this, is that garbage in, you get garbage out. And that's what they're doing with these models.
That's right.
But as far as the nitrogen, there was a discovery at the beginning of the last century by a German, Fritz Haber, who was a friend of Einstein, who developed a system where you could use methane, natural gas, to crack the nitrogen in the atmosphere. Because the problem with the nitrogen in the atmosphere is it is a molecule, N2, that cannot be used by most plants. Some bacteria, some other organisms can break it down. But what the Haber-Bosch method did was it created ammonia. It created the natural fertilizer, the artificial fertilizer, rather, industry. And that is why we have 8 billion people on the planet today, is because we can produce fertilizer. The environmentalists want us to go back to manure. So you can actually say these environmentalists are full of crap. And their intent is to reduce the population. So that's why they want to cut down on the use of nitrogen fertilizer.
Okay, a question has come in from Tony, who I think is up in Chicago. He says, to fight droughts in especially West Texas, would building many nuclear desalination plants help solve the problem? Could building of the North American Water and Power Alliance water project be accelerated to help also? How can we pay for this? What else could be done? And for those of you that don't live in Texas, but maybe you like to eat a steak or a hamburger every once in a while, it is really quite vicious. The drought in Central Texas has these ranchers lined up for miles and miles and miles, taking their cattle to slaughter before full maturity because they can't feed them. The hay is out of their reach, and you begin to think it's deliberate. But anyway, so Tony's asking about the droughts. What can we do in the short term? What can we do in the medium and long term? Joel, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, on the beef, it's interesting. The same people who want to shut down the fossil fuel industry want to eliminate beef. They want to eliminate animal protein. They want you to live on soy burgers. So this is part of this environmentalism, and it's not just government, world government. They want to kill people. And the way you eliminate people is you shut down food production. And they want to shut down cattle production in Texas. Now, as far as the water, we need to build that North American Water and Power Alliance, which was on the books 60 years ago. John F. Kennedy was talking about it. Robert F. Kennedy was talking about it. Frank Boss, a senator from Utah, was pushing it. And it was all shut down after the assassinations. So again, the same people who don't want to use nuclear, don't want to use fossil fuels, don't want you to eat beef, they don't want you to have water. They want to depopulate the West and say, see, this is a desert, let nature take its course. Well, that's why God gave us a mind to understand universal principles so we can develop nature like a garden instead of being a bunch of ridiculous apes who have no idea how to do anything. So yes, we can deal with the water problem, and it's going to take an effort to get all of the billions of dollars we've wasted on wind turbines, on solar panels, on derivatives. We have plenty of money. We have plenty of money to keep a war going in Central Europe. But we need to redirect those credits and those funds into productive activity like water projects and nuclear projects.
Yes, and I just began to take a preliminary look at the costs of these windmills. One of my naive friends says, oh, but wind power is so wonderful because air is free. Air is free. Sunlight is free, right? And what I've pieced together that each one of these wind turbines costs about $3 million, thereabouts. There's the erection, there's the engineering, there's the maintenance, which is substantial. Then the life of these ugly, spidery things is maybe 3 years, and then you have to retool it and replace it. So does that sound free to you? I don't know how many turbines are supposed to be out there in the Gulf in a space bigger than the size of Houston. But I would bet it's going to be in the thousands. So do the arithmetic. And how many people could you feed? How many nuclear power plants could you build? This is a crime, and Joel, and I am helping Joel coordinate his campaign. We are going to make this resonate in this campaign, that this cannot be allowed to happen. This diversion of funds, of federal monies into wars and bailouts and regressive 14th century technologies. We're not going to have Houston become the paradigm for that. As some of you may have questions about the North American Water and Power Alliance, I'm going to go back to the same pamphlet I was showing you before. If you can take a look at this. This was a project when we had a far-reaching vision of the future back in the 50s and 60s. That would divert about 10% of the abundant runoff water that comes across the Pacific on what's called the prevailing westerlies, bumps into the Rocky Mountains up there around Seattle, Vancouver, and upward toward Alaska, and takes about 10% of it southward to through a series of canals and aqueducts, and then replenishes the river systems and replenishes the aquifers. Okay, and you can see there that it would take it all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of the forest fires that Dr. Frank talked about in California probably would not have happened that this abundant new source of fresh water was made available. But there was a paradigm shift after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. La, 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 live for today. Don't think about the future. Well, we have to start thinking about the future. And Joel, what is the slogan for your campaign?
It's a positive vision for the future.
Right. Dr. Frank, do you have anything to say about, Tony's question on desalination or the drought itself? Anything?
Well, we're not going to control these big, massive areas of hot air. Nature does that, and we can't control nature, but we can do things like this water and pump water around. And I have no problem with nuclear power.
And of course, if you bring in the water, then that water transpires, it evaporates, it comes back down.
That's right.
There's been limited applications in Israel and the United Arab Emirates and so forth, where they have literally positively transformed the environment. So that it is possible to improve the environment, impossible and necessary. That is the prerogative of us as human beings, going all the way back to the book of Genesis. Have dominion over nature, improve upon nature. We have working with us some farmers, for this is their sacred cause for existence, and yet these farmers are being told that they're the bad guys because they're using fertilizer and other activities. Well, those of you who like to eat need to join this campaign. Let me see if I have any more questions here. Just a second. So Mason again says the people spreading fake news because fake news spreads 6 times faster than true news, he says. Well, maybe it does, but there's also something called reality, if you, which is beginning to hit right now. There's this question, are we in a recession? Or are we not in a recession? President Biden's out there saying, no, the numbers look good. We're not in a recession. Things are really not as bad as they look. But of course, if you've lost your job, you can't afford to gas up your car. The kids have lost their jobs and moved back in with mom and pop. Well, it's a recession because you're living it. So I don't have any more questions right now. I will put it out there again that we have Dr. Frank and Joel DeJean for a few more, a bit more time. This is your chance. We intend to put Joel DeJean in the Congress, and I, as an independent in this brand new district. And that is extremely a challenge for those of us, the petition to get Joel on the ballot. You would get all this pragmatic pushback. Independents never win. Why are you doing this? Okay. And of course, I can talk about my 35-year relationship with Mr. LaRouche, who ran for president 8 times and actually got on nationwide TV the night before Jimmy Carter dubiously won the 1976 election, what you would call the first really green Democrat, and forecast a lot of what we saw. You have to fight for the truth no matter what. But Joel, let me put it to you again, profoundly. Why are you entering this race? What do you expect to accomplish? And what do you expect of the people out here to do?
Look, the lies are easy to spread, but it's the truth that will set you free. And what we have to do, I have to use this campaign to educate people to use their God-given minds. Because when God said to have dominion over the earth, that includes the rest of the solar system, the galaxy, and the whole universe. So if you look at mankind's history, it's always been a handful of individuals who created the Great Renaissance, a handful of individuals who created the nuclear industry. Admiral Rickover, who was the commanding officer Jimmy Carter is probably rolling in his grave with what Jimmy Carter became. But he created the nuclear navy, and the nuclear navy created the commercial nuclear industry. And if we had continued to use that model, we would have had a commercial thermonuclear fusion industry. So reality has a way of catching up with the lies. And if we don't deal with reality, then I'm afraid we will have something that will solve the imagined global warming, which is what Joe mentioned earlier. If we have a nuclear war, we won't have to worry about global warming because we'll have a new ice age created almost immediately, a global winter. So if we don't change what we're doing, we're heading towards disaster, hyperinflation, depression, and war. And if people know there's an alternative, then they'll choose that alternative. They did with Roosevelt, they did with Lincoln, and they're going to have to do it again with my campaign and Diane Sayre's campaign in New York State.
Yeah, I'll mention Diane Sayre. Joel is part of a team. This is the 1-2 punch. And Diane, I'm proud to say we placed her on the ballot in New York City, or in New York State, through a superhuman effort, which got something like 62,000 signatures above and beyond what was required, 45,000 signatures. But we did it. And her independent voice will be a very resonant force for the good as we're heading into a terminal crisis in the financial system. The Federal Reserve is jacking up the interest rates again this week. Do people remember Jimmy Carter's war on inflation? Interest rates went up to 22%. The savings and loans were wiped out. That's when the farmers rolled into Washington because we lost thousands of farms during that period. There's got to be more in the recipe book than just simply, as someone would say, constipation versus diarrhea of the money supply, because the real economy is not the money, it's the farmers, it's the producers. That's what is under assault right now with this climate hysteria. We're here in Houston, the media is beating the drum that we should feel ashamed, of Houston's history as the energy hub in Texas. But we're going to come back to Joel for one final comment. I'll check for questions. You still have a chance to send questions in. But Dr. Frank, you have the advantage of having a few more years on us. You told me as a little kid, you actually witnessed some of those dust bowls up there up in Oklahoma or Kansas. And somehow through human intervention, planting of trees, irrigation projects, and so forth, we move beyond that. And I think that's what we're called upon to do now. What do you think?
Well, I was a preteen in the 30s when we had the Dust Bowl, and I can remember how bitter and how bad it was. There was just dirt everywhere. It was unreal. And but that was caused by a weather event, this big dome of hot air that didn't move. Now, there was some problems, and we had dug up a lot of the grasslands and things. I understand all that, but still, the main impact was a huge dome of hot air, and we've seen nothing like that in recent years.
Yeah, and I want to just really, and then I'm going to come up back to you. I'll check for questions one last time. So out there in internet land, now's your chance. But remember what Dr. Frank said, 0.04% of the atmosphere. That's what it's hovering around with tiny fluctuations, carbon dioxide. And yet it is the essence of what nourishes plant life. They take that carbon dioxide out of the air. They mix it with water. and sunshine, and that creates the carbohydrates that are the essence for life and growth on planet Earth. But from this 0.04%, which people like Mark Carney and Sir Michael Bloomberg and Klaus Schwab and the oligarchy want to bury, through sequestration, they are planning on creating they've already got a very substantial derivatives market in carbon futures, carbon offsets, carbon futures, carbon credits, carbon debits, and so forth. And I read in the Chronicle today talking about this windmill project that that the people that take the risk of developing these windmills, they're all going to have to take out very substantial insurance policies, right? You get it? It's not about delivering the energy to a population that needs it dependably and reliably. It's a money game to loot the productive portion of the economy to feed the parasites in private finance. And as I said, the world is moving on. They're catching on to this game. And this is one of the reasons why the hysteria about China and Russia and the BRICS, which are figuring out different ways of financing their own development, independent of this dollar empire, which is going down like Humpty Dumpty. But we all here in Houston remember Enron. One day they were the geniuses and the next day they were the jerks. Well, that's what's going to happen with these Davos types very soon, but it requires the leadership of people like Joel to set the record straight. And let me just check one more time for questions here, and then we might wrap it up. A final question, and I don't know if anyone can answer this because we don't have the inside knowledge, but Diane is asking about the people at NASA that should know better. And of course, when you look at that James Webb telescope, you're looking back billions of years, and what do you see out there? Climate change. It's a question of, something that's been going on for a long time. But she asked, why do so many people at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration believe in the carbon hoax? Is it true, or or are they going along to get along? What do you think, Joel?
I don't believe most of them believe that it's true. It's just decisions are made at the top by lawyers, accountants, political science majors, journalism professors, who, like I said, don't know the difference between a kilowatt and a kilojoule. And they're the ones setting the policy. We used to have great leadership. John F. Kennedy was not an aerospace engineer. He was not an astronaut. There were no astronauts around that time. But he provided political leadership, and science is political. And there is a dome of hot air now. It's not over the center part of the United States, it's over Washington. And we're partially right. Biden is partially right. We're not in a recession, we're in a depression. And we're about to go into a blowout. So there is an alternative. We know what to do. And the people at NASA, I'll give you one example. The James Webb telescope was almost canceled 4 years ago. When satellites ascend into space, they have to undergo what's called a shake and bake, where they have to go into a vibration chamber where the things are shaken to simulate the launch, and an environmental chamber where it simulates the temperatures in deep space. Well, when the James Webb underwent the shake, screws were too loose and the screws fell out of the space shield, of the sun shield. Well, NASA appointed a seasoned engineer named Greg Robinson, who didn't want the job, but he took the job, and he coordinated and made sure that all the specifications were followed by all the contractors. You can imagine a conductor facing an orchestra. He conducted the refurbishing of that space telescope. And that is why it deployed flawlessly because of a NASA individual who happens to be an engineer who was trained, educated at Howard University. So he's a Black engineer at NASA. There are great people at NASA. They just need some political backup to steer them in the right direction.
Yes. Go ahead, Dr. Frank.
Yeah, I got a comment on that. One of the senior people at over at APA, he was a believer in global warming. And then somebody challenged him to look at the data. He looked at the data and he looked at it so hard that he wrote his own book. You know, I've got over 30 books that were written by skeptics, many of them just like him. And so he became a skeptic. And Obama sent a letter down to his boss one day and said, I want you to write up a speech for me that emphasizes global warming. So he went to this gentleman and said, well, you write that speech. And he says, look, I just looked at the data. Look what the data says. And he said, if you mess this up, I'll fire you. That's the problem internally of the government. You don't want to cross over any of these people that are pushing you on the global warming.
And so, so someone quoted to me in the just as a comment in the text box, where there is no vision, the people perish.
That's right.
There's also, I think it's in Ephesians, who shall follow an uncertain trumpet? And Joel is dedicated to be that certain trumpet in this campaign. And we don't have that much time. And I'm asking everyone out there, if you were tongue-tied tonight on the questions, you can send them in afterwards to Joel DeJean for Congress @gmail.com. But we not only need your suggestions and questions, we really need help in opening doors for Joel in this district to speak in front of your little church group or your Kiwanis club or whatever, you know, or in your front yard or backyard. We have to find the means to get Joel's message out. My name is Joe Jennings. You can send it to my attention. We also need contributions, so you can find a donate link on the website, which is joeldejeanforcongress.com. You can also look there and see the substantial work that Joel has done on the question of fusion energy. You know, I mean, Joel was part of something called the Fusion Energy Foundation, which at its peak had a subscription and regular readership of its Fusion magazine of 250,000 back and peaked in 1987 when it was shut down on orders of the government to silence these ideas. So that might go back to the NASA question again. There is a vicious, you look at all the great scientists that had to fight for the truth, Lavoisier, Kepler, and so forth. They were all swimming against the tide, but they were inspired against a higher vision of man's place in the universe as relation to as a co-creator of the universe for our responsibility today. And so I would just simply say, Dr. Frank, if you have any last words, or if not, Joel, any last words to wrap up and what you're asking of your potential voters out there in the 38th district?
I just hope to give them hope that the future is up to them. And Dr. Frank, I want to thank you for participating. And I consider you a national treasure, and you give me hope that we can find enough people who will speak the truth, no matter what the Chronicle says.
There you go. And also, we hope that this there will be more forums like this, right? On broader aspects of the thing. I don't think the hyperinflation, the problems that they're lying about, they're not going to go away. They're continually going to expand and accelerate. And so people will be looking for answers. And so keep an eye on your inbox. We'll be announcing our next webcast. But once again, I concur 100% with Joel, Dr. Frank. our hand and hearts go out to you. And Joel, good Godspeed with your campaign as it moves forward. And everyone out there, we welcome and thank you for participating in this this webcast this evening. And with that, I'll wish you all good evening. Thank you very much.